In 2018, I was in the US, in Massachusetts, and I was told by an Irish American guy who was Catholic that the Catholic Church in the US is Protestant.
Interesting. The Catholic Church in the U.S. is Protestant. I think the Catholics in America are authentically Catholic. Faithful Catholics are authentically Catholic. They care a lot about the teachings of the Church. I think in some ways, because we're a Protestant country, there is almost an extra impulse, an extra desire to be specifically Catholic, to promote things like the Rosary and the traditional Latin Mass, like those things that are the furthest from being Protestant, because it is, a Protestant country, and so to kind of define ourselves as something different. Catholics want to be very distinctively Catholic in America. But I see perhaps where he's coming from, that maybe culturally Catholicism feels a little bit Protestant because it feels American, and American culture has been very shaped by Protestantism. So, for example, I'm thinking of when I was young, I went to praise and worship nights that had more, charismatic music in like a big stadium, and that feels a little Protestant. Like Protestants are the ones that pioneered those things. I think of actually so much of what is successful in American Catholicism today, the kind of evangelization efforts, were pioneered by Protestants first. So I'm thinking of organizations like Focus that send missionaries to college campuses across America, and even in Europe as well. Like they're starting to send missionaries here too. That, I think, was pioneered by Campus Crusade for Christ. Or, just thinking of Catholic influencers. In some ways, I think Catholic influencers are doing a lot better than Protestant influencers today. They're more successful. But I think that kind of media savvy was pioneered first by Protestant Americans. In terms of kind of the content of the faith, Pope Leo XIII condemned a heresy that he called Americanism. And there's some controversy about whether Americanism, how real it was, how many people really held to those beliefs, or whether it was just the ideas of a few intellectuals, Catholic intellectuals in America. But if you look at the ideas that were condemned, they were, Protestant adjacent ideas. It was like downplaying religious life, like downplaying life as a monk or a nun. It was downplaying spiritual direction and focusing more on kind of your own internal spiritual experience, downplaying Catholic doctrine. So perhaps there are some of those tendencies. I think many Catholics find a home in the Republican Party, in conservative politics. And what does conservative mean? There are different factions of conservatism, of course, but I think Catholics maybe imbibe some more Protestant ideals through politics without really noticing it. And so in that sense, maybe Catholicism is a bit more Protestant in the sense that if you're a faithful Catholic, generally you tend to be politically conservative as well, or even politically Republican, and that in becoming politically conservative, politically Republican, you will probably take on some ideas that were informed by a more Protestant worldview.
And how do you see how the role of the Catholic Church is changing in the US while the Latino population is growing because they are also Catholic?
So, yeah, it's a good question too. They are making the country more Catholic, for sure. It's an interesting population to study in terms of the faith in America. Many of the Hispanics that come to America quickly become Protestant once they arrive in America. And a lot of these non-denominational evangelical churches do very well with Hispanics. So, I mean, to the credit of Hispanics, when they come to America, they tend to assimilate really well. I wish that they wouldn't assimilate into our religious tradition as much as a Catholic. Many of them become Protestant, and I wrote a piece for National Catholic Register earlier this year that was talking about vocations, ordinations to the priesthood. And one of the trends that I found is that in dioceses where the Hispanic population is high, ordinations to the priesthood tend to be low. So I think there is a sense that, well, Hispanics are more Catholic than the average American, or more likely to be Catholic than the average American. The practice of the faith is not as strong as I think as faithful Catholics would hope that it would be. That certainly there is a strong piety and devotion, and I think a true love for Christ, a love for his mother, a love for his church, respect for the clergy, all these good things. But it may be the typical Hispanic Catholic looks different than the typical, European descent Catholic, Irish, Italian, or a mix of many different things. So it is a little bit more complicated than simply saying there's a lot of Hispanics moving to America, therefore America is becoming very Catholic. I'll say that that's true, but with the caveats that what it means to be Catholic is slightly different in general in Hispanic culture. Not to say that there aren't very devout, very faithful Hispanic Catholics. There are tons of them. And also that, with the caveat that many of them become Protestant. Just as so much of Latin America is becoming Protestant. I think that is perhaps an underreported story, that American missionaries have spent such a long time and have spent so much effort converting Catholics in South America, Central America, to American-style evangelicalism. It's really changed the nature of religion in Latin America too. So many of these people coming to America are probably Protestants already, or even Mormons already, Jehovah's Witnesses already.
And what kind of challenges is the Catholic Church facing in the US right now?
Well, I think first and foremost is decline in the faith, which is such a pervasive story that it's almost like we're fish in water at this point. Like it's just taken for granted that the faith is declining, that vocations are going down, that more and more people are identifying as unaffiliated religiously, less people are going to church. So I think that first and foremost is the most significant challenge, especially since really the mission of the church is to save souls, to bring people to heaven. And if people are turning away from the sacraments, turning away from Christ, there's no issue that's bigger than that. So that's a really big issue that I hope that Pope Leo tackles. I think he understands it in a deep way, because I think he's the first pope that we've really had that came of age in that time of transition and decline, kind of 1960s, 1970s. So I think that's significant. Now I'll add that there are very hopeful signs on that as well. It seems like Generation Z, young people in their 20s, are turning back to church. They're reporting higher rates of belief in God. It seems like faith, authentic Christian faith, is flourishing on the internet. It's seen as cool even on the internet. So I think there's very promising signs for the future. And maybe what we'll find is that this decline in faith was just an aberration that came out of a particular period in time, 1960s, 1970s, kind of the boomer generation, and the pendulum is swinging back. But decline is still a significant issue. in the church in America. I'll also add, I think it's less of an issue than it is here in Europe. I think America, it's easy to say, is the most religious major country in the West. If you look at any metric, church attendance, belief in God, regular prayer, all of these kind of things. America has really kind of bucked the trend for wealthy countries. And I think that's why America is kind of leading the way in evangelization globally today. So I think it's extremely fitting that we have a pope from America at this moment in time. I guess another challenge kind of stemming from that decline is what is going to happen to this massive infrastructure that was built up for the church in America, these Catholic schools, these Catholic institutions like hospitals, parishes, and I think many dioceses are getting to the point where they are realizing there has to be a major downsizing, and that's going to be a very painful process. I'm not sure what that looks like exactly, but you know, my parish that I grew up in closed when I was growing up, and that was a hard process. You know, you feel a very strong emotional attachment to something as deep as the faith where you, or the place where you encountered God, where you grew in your faith. So that's going to be a challenge. I think the church is still reeling from the repercussions of the sex abuse crisis. And it's just going to be a difficult period of healing. I think a lot of trust in the church was lost during that time. I think I've seen statistics showing a lot of the decline in Catholicism happened, or at least sped up, after 2002, when was the first abuse crisis. But I think maybe we're seeing a recovery now. I think the numbers since after COVID have been very positive. We've seen an uptick. But it's just a problem that has to be reckoned with. It's very good that it was reckoned with. I hope that it has been fully reckoned with, and that that the church is able to heal and to regain that trust. Obviously, there's no way to go back and undo what happened, but it's possible to move forward and to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated.
Today you said that Pope Leo is kind of referee.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of teams are playing on this stadium ground?
That's a good question. Yeah, I should give credit to my friend Jonathan Liedl, colleague at the National Catholic Register, who wrote an article. He didn't use referee. He said umpire, like in a baseball game. But I thought for the audience tonight, referee would make more sense. What are the teams? I think it's hard not to view the church in terms of two teams. I know there are issues with this framework, but it just seems to be the reality of how people think about it. It seems like the teams, to put it really broad, conservatives and progressives. And conservatives are those who, I would say, believe the authentic teachings of the church. They believe that the church cannot change because the church has proclaimed that it cannot change. And that it hasn't changed for 2,000 years. It has always taught the same truth. Of course, with more refinement and answering specific cultural questions and coming to deeper understandings of things, yes, but never contradicting itself. And I think the progressives in the church believe that it can change. Or at least, if they would say that they're not trying to change the church, I think they set themselves apart from the conservatives by saying that certain things can be developed that the conservatives would say cannot be developed. So what are the dividing lines? It's same-sex marriage, ordaining women to the priesthood, contraception, abortion, traditional Latin Mass I would put in there too. But that actually I feel like could be a different team, or at least like a subset of one of the factions, or the traditionalists. And I guess the way that I would see traditionalism, or the way that I would define it, as like a separate group from the conservatives, is people who believe that Vatican II was a mistake, or that there were problems so fundamental within Vatican II that essentially we just need to go back and kind of forget about Vatican II. And that is a small but loud and growing faction within the church. That I would say is something a little different than just kind of your run-of-the-mill conservative Catholic. I think most conservatives have a lot of sympathy for the traditional Latin Mass and would like to see it permitted, at least encouraged even. But those I think are essentially the teams. There's 100 different ways that you could divide that up. But I think in terms of people's loyalties, like who do they feel is they're united with, I think it's those two, maybe three.
And what kind of changes do you expect from Pope Leo in the Catholic Church?
Challenge? Well, he certainly has a lot of challenges on his plate just with this division in the church. Also, I don't want to overstate the division. I think it exists, but in my mind, the kind of progressive wing of the church is fading. It's on its way out. I think if you look at statistics of priests in America, they've been doing a survey for many years asking priests to identify as liberal, conservative, very conservative, and we've seen basically the extinction of the liberal category among the clergy, certainly among young priests, like recently ordained priests, who have grown up in the era of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, just a very conservative popes. Which, I mean, I would say conservative Catholics, I would include myself there, don't necessarily like the term conservative. It almost makes it seem like that's just one potential alternative among different options. Whereas I think simply what it means is just like to be faithful to the true doctrine of the Catholic Church. So I think there are those who kind of came of age in the Vatican II era that are perhaps, I think they don't represent the moment that the church is in right now. And so I think really this conclave was probably the last conclave where their influence will be, it's like the high water mark, maybe, is the best way to put it, of their influence. Because, I mean, once you get much younger than these cardinals, I think you're going to find a lot more conservatism, faithfulness to the Church's teachings. I even hesitate to say that because, the cardinals who are considered progressive, if you really press them on these issues, they'll say, the Church can't change its teachings on same-sex marriage, things like that. Not all of them, but I would say most of them. I mean, as much as Francis was interpreted as being a progressive, when he was asked directly on these questions, he often gave very clear responses to it. So anyway, I think this is just going to be a big challenge of Leo's pontificate is how to handle that. I think he's really positioned himself as a unifier, rather than stoking the flames in one direction or the other. I think he realizes we just need to stop the house fire. Like just lower the temperature, and recognize that fundamentally we are one church. We're not multiple churches, which I think is very needed at this point in the church. So that's a challenge. I think some of the challenges that he's pointed to, like the rise of AI and the thorny questions that poses for the human person, human flourishing, what that means for Catholic theology on a lot of moral questions, I think is maybe up in the air right now. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting and pivotal time in the church, and I think the role that Leo might end up playing, like you say, is referee or umpire, who just gives the church space to kind of develop organically during this time. I think a lot of Catholics felt that Francis perhaps got in the way of that, or and I think especially with traditional Latin Mass, to me it makes sense to, as Benedict did, just allow it to breathe and see what happens. Maybe it becomes more popular, maybe not, maybe that leads to some kind of, maybe it ends up informing the Novus Ordo, the new rites of the Mass. So, as I was saying in the talk tonight, I think with every council it takes some time to digest, and that can be decades. I think the Church is probably still in a process of digesting Vatican II. Vatican II is still a very live and hot question. And I don't just mean with traditionalists who say that it should be thrown out altogether, but I even think, in terms of what emphases of Vatican II should be focused on, what Vatican II means, how to approach this idea of the spirit of Vatican II. So, a pivotal time. I think it's good that we have a calm, steady hand like Pope Leo can.
And what do you think about how the ideas of St. Augustine influencing now the Church, because the Pope comes from, let's say, that direction?
Right. Yeah. The Church's philosophy and teachings have been so informed by Aquinas, especially since the late 1800s, with kind of the Neo-Thomism return to Aquinas. Aquinas is very formulaic, scientific almost, in the way that he approaches theological questions. Augustine, I think, is much more perhaps metaphorical or literary. He's a little, I mean, sometimes the Eastern Orthodox will talk about the divide between them and the Catholics in this way, that the Catholics are very formulaic and mathematical, and the Orthodox are just kind of mystical. They're open to mystery and just letting some questions be open-ended. Yeah, I don't want to. I should say my knowledge of Augustine isn't extremely deep, but I could see perhaps that being a fruit of Leo's Augustinian thoughts. Is just that the way that he speaks about the teachings of the Church is in a more experiential, existential way than a scientific, formulaic way. But I think Augustine is a great model. I think actually for a world that needs conversion, unlike perhaps any other time in the history of the Church, Augustine is a great example. Augustine was he was brilliant, and And kind of, he embraced Gnostic ideas. He was living a worldly life. That sounds a lot like the world today. That sounds like a lot of former Catholics today, just embracing false ideas, living in a worldly way. And Augustine converted, and he converted with a great ferocity, and he helped to establish Christendom. I think if that's going to be the model for Leo's papacy, then I think we're in for a time of flourishing in springtime in the church.
And a few days ago, there were visitors in Rome from Hollywood. Did you follow the news?
I'm familiar with it. I didn't follow it too closely, but yes, I know what you're referring to.
Do you expect more movies related to religion after this visit?
Well, that's interesting. Pope Leo just announced last week what his favorite movies are as well. So, if that is the case, and perhaps that is the case, I can see. Like I said, I think Leo is of a different generation. He grew up, like I say, in a time of secularization and the decline of the influence of the church. So I think maybe he understands what we're up against more acutely than popes that preceded him. And so I think just a big part of why the church has declined in influence probably I think is media, that it was just media that was hostile or ambivalent to the church. That's movies and music and all these kind of things. And the church has always been a great producer of beauty throughout its history, right? The greatest works of art, the greatest works of architecture and paintings and music have come from the church. And it seems like we in the 20th century fell behind. And on movies, so a lot of Christian movies, they're well-meaning, but they're a little cringe, as Gen Z might say, with notable exceptions. But I would be very encouraged if that is part of Leo's goal as Pope. I think that's something that could be very unifying as well. And I think Hollywood has a fascination with Catholicism too. I think it can't help but be a little bit fascinated with Catholicism. It maybe stands opposed to the values that the church teaches, but I think it recognizes that kind of the beauty that exists in Catholicism, and that is something that's just like, it's so good for filmmakers. There's something just so much more powerful about a scene of somebody praying alone in a dark church with kind of incense floating about them and candles lit here and there, and a statue of Christ and a statue of beheaded John the Baptist or something like that. I think there is this kind of love-hate relationship between Hollywood and the Catholic Church. So if that would become more of a love-love relationship, to the extent that that's possible, I would be very happy.